Well, howdy, partner. Name's Eureka Earl, and I thank you kindly for stopping by Guns and Nuggets. Round these parts, we spin tales where gold was struck, guns were drawn, and legends made. If this here story tickles your fancy, don't be shy. Tip your hat with a like, hitch your wagon with a subscribe, and tell your trail mates. Plenty more tales are waiting. Howdy, partner. Name's Earl, and I appreciate you settling in with me tonight for another tale from the Old West. If you're enjoying these stories, hit that like button, subscribe, and pass the word along. We're keeping these legends alive, the true ones, the bloody ones, and the ones that still got something to teach us about greed and gold and what happens when a man can't never get enough. Now then, pull up close to the fire here. The night's got teeth to it, and we're gonna be here a spell. I got coffee brewing if you want it, strong and black as a moonless sky. And I got a story that's been told 1,000 ways, but I'm gonna tell it to you straight. No dime novel romance, no prettying it up. Just the truth about a man who became a legend and died because of it. Jesse James. You know the name. Everybody does. The outlaw, the rebel, the man who supposedly robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. Hell, they made him into Robin Hood with a six-shooter, turned him into a hero for folks who felt stepped on by banks and railroads and Yankee carpetbaggers. But let me tell you something about Jesse James that the dime novels won't. The man was a thief, a stone-cold, Bible-quoting, mama-loving thief who turned greed into his religion and counted his sins in gold coins. Folks remember him as a legend, romanticize him, make songs about him, turn him into something he never was. But the ground remembers him different. The ground remembers him as a man who robbed his own kind, betrayed his own people, and died with a bullet in his back put there by somebody he called friend. Picture Missouri with me now. Not the Missouri of today, but the Missouri of 1882, the year Jesse met his end. Rolling prairie grass, tall as a man's waist in some places, moving in the wind like waves on a green ocean. Farmhouses scattered across the land, wood smoke rising from chimneys, the smell of cattle and horses and honest sweat. This was border country, where North met South, where the war had torn families apart and left scars that still hadn't healed near 20 years later. The wind moves through that tall grass different than it moves through trees. It whispers. Sounds almost like voices if you listen close, voices of men Jesse left buried behind him. Bank clerks shot dead for being too slow, opening the safe. Train guards killed for reaching for their weapons. Townspeople cut down just for standing in the wrong place when the James gang came riding through. See, that's what people forget when they sing those ballads about Jesse James. They forget the bodies. They forget the widows. They forget the children who grew up without fathers because Jesse needed another bag of gold more than those men needed their lives. I'm sitting here tonight on my porch in Missouri, not far, actually, from where Jesse used to hide out between robberies. These hills have seen a lot. They've watched empires rise and fall, watched the buffalo disappear and the railroads come, watched the grass get plowed under and turned into farmland. But they still remember Jesse James. Still remember the sound of hoofbeats in the night, the crack of gunfire, the jangle of stolen gold in leather saddlebags. The sky tonight is clear, stars spread out thick as spilled salt. Moon's just a sliver, which is the kind of night Jesse preferred for his work. Dark enough to hide in, light enough to see where you're going. The kind of night when decent folks bar their doors and blow out their lamps early, hoping trouble rides on past their property. But trouble had a way of finding folks in Jesse's day, had a way of kicking down doors and pointing guns at hard-working people who'd never done nothing but try to make an honest living. And more often than not, that trouble wore Jesse's face. Now, I know what you're thinking. You've heard the other version. You've heard that Jesse was a hero, a Confederate soldier who never stopped fighting the Yankees even after the war ended. You've heard he only robbed Yankee banks and railroad companies, the big corporations that were squeezing the little man. You've heard he was a champion of the common folk. That's the legend. And legends got a way of smoothing out the rough edges, of turning murderers into martyrs and thieves into saints. But I'm here to tell you the truth, and the truth is this. Jesse James robbed everybody. Didn't matter if you were northern or southern, rich or poor, friend or stranger. If you had something Jesse wanted, he'd take it. And if you got in his way, he'd kill you. The farms around here, they're quiet now, peaceful. Corn's been harvested, fields are resting for winter. But back in Jesse's day, these same farms lived in fear, 'cause Jesse didn't just rob banks in far-off cities. He robbed his neighbors, robbed people who'd fought for the same cause he had, who'd bled for the same flag. He'd shake a man's hand on Sunday, share a meal at his table, then come back Thursday night with guns drawn and take everything that man had saved. That's the part the songs don't sing about. The betrayal, the way Jesse turned on his own kind, robbed from the very people who'd hidden him, fed him, lied to the law for him. He claimed it was justice, claimed he was getting revenge on a world that had wronged him. But justice don't ride with a mask on. Justice don't shoot unarmed men. And justice sure as hell don't count its righteousness in stolen gold. I got a photograph here, old tintype, faded and cracked. Shows Jesse James standing proud, hand resting on his pistol, hat tilted just so. Handsome devil, I'll give him that. Had that look about him that made young men want to follow him and young women want to save him. But look closer at those eyes. Look past the pose and the pride. You can see it if you know what to look for, the emptiness, the hunger that nothing could ever fill. That's what greed does to a man. Hollows him out from the inside until there's nothing left but the wanting. Jesse had money, Lord knows he had money. Had fine horses, fine clothes, fine everything. Could have stopped 100 times, could have taken what he'd stolen and disappeared into a peaceful life. But he couldn't stop counting, couldn't stop reaching for more. The gold had him by then, had its teeth sunk deep, and it wasn't letting go. The fire's crackling nice now, throwing shadows that dance across the porch boards, kind of shadows that might look like riders if you had a mind to see them that way. Riders on horseback, faces covered, guns drawn, coming out of the darkness to take what ain't theirs. This here's a long story, partner, and we're just getting started. We got to talk about the war that made Jesse the guerrilla fighting, the burning and killing and raping that passed for soldiering along the Missouri-Kansas border. We got to talk about the robberies, the shootouts, the lawmen who hunted him, and the friends who betrayed him. We got to talk about Northfield, Minnesota, where Jesse's luck finally ran out and his gang got shot to pieces in the street. And we got to talk about that morning and street. Joseph, when Robert Ford put a bullet in Jesse's back and ended the legend. But before we get to all that, you need to understand something about the country Jesse came from and the times that shaped him. 'Cause nobody's born evil. Nobody comes into this world with murder in their heart and greed in their soul. That's something that gets built, piece by piece, choice by choice, until one day you look in the mirror and don't recognize what's looking back at you. Jesse James was born in Clay County, Missouri in 1847. His daddy was a Baptist preacher ironing there, ain't it? His mama was a strong woman, tough as a pine knot, who'd outlive both her famous sons and spend her last years selling rocks from Jesse's grave to tourists for a quarter apiece. They were decent people, far as anybody could tell. Owned a farm, worked hard, went to church. But Missouri in the 1,850 seconds was a powder keg waiting for a match. Border state, half slave, half free, with folks on both sides ready to kill each other over which way the territory would go. By the time Jesse was 14, the Civil War had come to Missouri, and it came ugly. Not the clean battles you read about in books, but neighbor against neighbor violence that made the devil himself take notes. The wind's picking up now, moving through the grass with that whispering sound I mentioned. If you listen real close, you can almost hear names. Names of banks Jesse robbed, names of towns he terrorized, names of men he killed. They all blend together after a while, become just another verse in a long, bloody song. But we'll get to all that. For now, just know this. Jesse James wasn't no Robin Hood. He was a thief and a killer who robbed his own kind and died counting coins that were never his to begin with. The legend says otherwise, but the ground knows the truth, and tonight, partner, I'm going to tell you what the ground remembers. Before we talk about the robberies, before we get to the blood and the gold and the legend, we got to talk about the war. 'Cause you can't understand Jesse James without understanding what the Civil War did to Missouri and what Missouri did to the boys who fought in it. Most folks think of the Civil War. They think of Gettysburg and Antietam, big battles with big armies, Generals Lee and Grant pushing toy soldiers across maps in fancy tents. But in Missouri, the war was something else entirely. Wasn't about grand strategy or preserving the Union or any of that noble horse shit. In Missouri, the war was personal. It was neighbor killing neighbor, brother killing brother, and the devil laughing at 'em all. See, Missouri was split right down the middle. Half the folks wanted to stay with the Union, half wanted to join the Confederacy, and neither side was willing to let the other side be. So while the big armies were marching back east, Missouri was tearing itself apart in a guerrilla war that made the regular fighting look civilized by comparison. That's where Jesse learned his trade. That's where he learned that killing could be easy if you convinced yourself the other fella deserved it. That's where he learned that taking what you wanted was just spoils of war, and that the line between soldier and outlaw was thinner than smoke. Jesse was just a boy when the war started, 14 years old, skinny and angry and looking for a cause to believe in. His family were slaveholders, Southern sympathizers, and when the Union troops came through Clay County requisitioning supplies and arresting Confederate sympathizers, they made an enemy of the James family. Story goes they whipped Jesse's stepfather, tried to hang him to make him tell where the Confederate guerrillas were hiding. Didn't kill him, but they might as well have for what it did to that family's loyalty. Young Jesse watched it happen, remembered it, let it fester inside him like a wound that wouldn't heal. And when his older brother Frank rode off to join up with the bushwhackers, that's what they called the Confederate guerrillas. Jesse couldn't wait to follow. He was 16 when he finally joined up with Bloody Bill Anderson's band. 16 years old and already hard as a coffin nail, ready to kill Yankees and call it patriotism. And Bill Anderson, well, he was the devil in human form if there ever was one. Made Quantrill look like a Sunday school teacher. Now, William Quantrill, you might have heard of him, led the raid on Lawrence, Kansas in 1863, burned the town to the ground and killed near 200 men and boys. That's the kind of war Jesse signed up for. Not battles fought by rules, but massacres dressed up as military operations. Jesse rode with Quantrill's raiders and later with Bloody Bill's bunch, and the things they did, Lord have mercy, the things they did don't belong in polite conversation. They didn't just fight Union soldiers, they murdered civilians, burned farms, tortured prisoners. They'd ride into a Union town, shoot every man they could find, take whatever wasn't nailed down, then burn what was left just for the sport of it. The guerrillas had a code, or what passed for one. They called themselves soldiers, but they dressed like civilians, hid among the population, struck without warning, and disappeared into the countryside before regular troops could respond. The Union called them bushwhackers, terrorists, criminals, and they were right mostly. But the guerrillas called the Union troops murderers and thieves, and they were right too. That's the thing about that kind of war. Everybody's right and everybody's wrong, and the only thing that matters is who's still standing when the smoke clears. Jesse took to it like a duck to water. Found out he had a talent for killing, and worse, found out he liked it. There's men who kill in war because they got to, 'cause it's them or the other fella, and they carry that weight for the rest of their lives. Then there's men like Jesse who kill and feel nothing, or worse, feel something good, feel powerful, feel alive. The stories from those days are hard to hear. Jesse and his bunch would ambush Union patrols, shoot soldiers who'd already surrendered, scalp them sometimes just to send a message. They'd rob Union supporters, farmers who'd voted the wrong way, merchants who'd sold supplies to federal troops and call it requisitioning for the Confederacy. But everybody knew most of that loot never made it to any Confederate quartermaster. It went into the guerrillas' pockets, turned into whiskey and women and poker games. That's when Jesse learned the most important lesson of his life. that violence could pay. That if you were willing to be ruthless enough, brutal enough, fast enough with a gun, you could take what you wanted and nobody could stop you. The law was 100 miles away. The army couldn't catch you if you knew the country, and if anybody tried to stand up to you, well, you just shot 'em and moved on. I got another photograph here. This one from 1864. Shows a group of guerrillas, maybe 20 of them, all armed to the teeth with revolvers stuck in their belts. They're young, most of them, teenagers really, but look at their eyes. Those ain't the eyes of boys, those are the eyes of men who've seen too much, done too much, and know they're probably gonna die before they turn 25. Jesse's in that photo somewhere, though I can't say for certain which one's him. They all look the same after a while, hard, cold, already half dead inside. The war did that. Turned farm boys into killers and called it necessity. The worst of it, the absolute worst, was what happened at Centralia in September of 1864. Union troops stopped a train, found 24 unarmed Confederate soldiers on leave, and executed them on the spot. Shot them down like dogs. Left their bodies in the dirt for their families to find. It was murder, plain and simple. War crime dressed up as military justice. Bill Anderson heard about it, and Bill Anderson decided to teach the Union a lesson about mercy. Jesse was there when Anderson's guerrillas ambushed a Union patrol of over 100 men near Centralia. The guerrillas numbered maybe 80, but they had surprise and they had rage and they had nothing to lose. They charged that Union line screaming like demons, guns blazing, and they tore through those Federal troops like a tornado through a wheat field. When it was over, near 100 Union soldiers lay dead. Most of them had been killed after they'd surrendered, executed, just like those Confederate boys on the train. Bill Anderson himself scalped several of the bodies. Jesse helped, probably even enjoyed it, if the stories are true. That's what war does when there ain't no rules. It turns men into monsters and monsters into legends, and by the time the war ended in 1865, Jesse James was both. Problem was, the war might have ended for everybody else, but it didn't end for Jesse. When Lee surrendered at Appomattox and the other guerrillas started drifting home, trying to pick up the pieces of their old lives, Jesse couldn't, didn't want to, maybe. He'd spent 3 years killing and stealing and calling it patriotism, and he wasn't ready to give that up. Story goes Jesse tried to surrender in May of 1865, rode into Lexington, Missouri, under a white flag, hoping for amnesty like the government had promised. But a Union patrol opened fire on him. Some say it was murder, some say Jesse went for his gun first. Either way, Jesse took a bullet to the chest, nearly died, and came out of it with a fresh reason to hate the Yankees and a conviction that the war wasn't over, not for him. His brother Frank went back to the farm, tried to live quiet, but Jesse couldn't settle, couldn't work a plow when he'd spent 3 years riding horses and taking what he wanted. Couldn't sit still when he'd spent 3 years moving fast, staying one step ahead of death. The war had taught Jesse that violence was the answer to every question. Taught him that the man with the fastest gun and the hardest heart got what he wanted. Taught him that rules were for other people, and that if you were smart enough and mean enough, you could live outside them. So when Jesse came home from the war, he didn't come home a soldier. He came home hungry. Hungry for the rush of riding into danger. Hungry for the weight of gold in his saddlebags. Hungry for the fear he saw in people's eyes when they recognized his name. The war had given him a taste for it, and now he couldn't live without it. That hunger, that appetite for violence and gold, that's what drove everything that came after. The robberies, the murders, the legend. Jesse James didn't become an outlaw in spite of the war. He became an outlaw because of it. The war made him, shaped him, turned him into something that couldn't exist in peacetime. And when the war ended and Jesse found himself without an enemy to fight, without a cause to kill for, he did what came natural. He found a new war. He found new enemies. He found banks and trains and stagecoaches full of gold. And he convinced himself that taking it was the same as what he'd been doing for the Confederacy. But it wasn't. During the war, he'd been a guerrilla fighter. Brutal, but at least fighting for something bigger than himself. After the war, he was just a thief with a gun and a story, but a thief all the same. The fire's burning low now. Need to add another log, keep the chill at bay. The night's only gonna get colder, and we got a long way to go yet in this story. Gotta talk about the robberies that made Jesse famous, the lies he told himself to justify him, and the people he hurt along the way, his own people, his own kind, folks who'd fought for the same cause he had. But that's for the next part. For now, just understand this. The war didn't end in 1865 for Jesse James. It just changed shape, changed from a fight for the South into a fight for himself. And that second war, that private war fought for gold and glory, that's the one that would eventually kill him. Pour yourself another cup of coffee, partner. This next part's where the legend really starts, where Jesse James stops being just another outlaw and becomes something bigger in folks' minds. Becomes a hero to some, a nightmare to others, and a liar to everybody. The first robbery happened on February 13th, 1866, less than a year after the war ended. Liberty, Missouri. The Clay County Savings Association Bank. 12 men rode into town in broad daylight, faces covered, guns drawn. 2 went inside while the others held the horses and kept watch. They walked up to the cashier, pointed their pistols at his head, and demanded he open the vault. The cashier, fellow named Greenup Bird, he tried to be brave, tried to stall, tried to talk 'em down. One of the robbers might have been Jesse, might have been Frank, nobody knows for sure. Pistol whipped him across the face and told him to hurry up or die slow. Bird opened the vault. They cleaned it out. $60,000 in gold, silver, and paper money. Biggest bank robbery in American history up to that point. On their way out of town, they shot a college boy named George Wymore. Just shot him down in the street for no reason except maybe he was in the wrong place, or maybe they were showing off, or maybe they just liked killing. The boy died right there in the mud, not even 20 years old, probably never held a gun in his life. That's how Jesse's outlaw career started, with an innocent boy bleeding out in the street while the robbers rode off laughing, divvying up the gold before they even made it out of the county. But here's where it gets interesting. Within a week, stories were circulating that the robbery wasn't just about money. No, sir. According to the stories, it was revenge, payback. The bank was owned by Union sympathizers, and the robbery was really just a continuation of the war guerrillas striking back at their oppressors. Never mind that most of the folks who'd lost money in that bank were Confederate veterans trying to rebuild their lives. Never mind that the boy they killed was just a student from a family that had fought for the South. Never mind any of that. The story was better if Jesse was fighting for a cause instead of just stealing for himself. And Jesse, he was smart enough to see how useful that story could be. Started cultivating it, feeding it, turning it into armor that protected him better than any steel plate. He'd give interviews to newspapers, send letters, really, since he couldn't exactly sit down face to face with reporters. And in those letters, he'd explain how he was forced into a life of crime, how the Yankees had persecuted him, how he only robbed from the rich to help the poor. It was horse shit, every word of it. But it was horse shit that people wanted to believe. See, Missouri after the war was a bitter place. A lot of folks felt like they'd lost everything, lost the war, lost their way of life, lost their dignity. The banks were foreclosing on farms. The railroads were charging outrageous rates to ship crops. Carpetbaggers from the north were buying up land cheap and making fortunes while Southern families starved. There was real anger, real resentment, real need for somebody to strike back. Jesse positioned himself as that somebody, the rebel who never surrendered, the Confederate soldier still fighting for Southern honor, the champion of the little man against the big banks and railroads. Problem was, it was all a lie. Jesse robbed everybody. Didn't matter if you were Northern or Southern, rich or poor, guilty or innocent. If you had money Jesse wanted, he'd take it. And if you happened to be his neighbor, his friend, somebody who'd sheltered him or fed him or lied to the law for him, well, that just made you an easier target, 'cause you already trusted him. I'll give you an example. In 1869, Jesse and his gang robbed the Daviess County Savings Association in Gallatin, Missouri. Small town, small bank, most of the depositors were farmers and small merchants Jesse's own kind. The cashier was a man named John Sheets, a Union veteran, sure, but also a father of 3 who'd never done nothing to Jesse or his family. Jesse walked up to the counter, pulled his gun, and shot Sheets in the head without saying a word. Killed him instant. Then cleaned out the till nothing, like the haul from Liberty, just a few $100. On the way out, Jesse's horse stumbled and threw him. He had to run through the street on foot while the townspeople shot at him, barely making it to his brother's horse and escaping. Later, Jesse claimed he'd killed Sheets because he thought Sheets was Samuel Cox, the Union officer who'd killed Bloody Bill Anderson during the war. Claimed it was revenge for his fallen commander. Noble, right? Justified killing in the name of the lost cause. Except Sheets wasn't Cox. Wasn't even close. Jesse had killed an innocent man, a husband and father, for a few $100 and a chance to feel like a warrior again. But the newspapers ate up the revenge story, turned Jesse into a tragic figure, a man haunted by war, striking out at his demons. That's when I really understood the genius of what Jesse was doing. He wasn't just robbing banks. He was robbing banks and selling a story at the same time. And the story was worth more than the gold, 'cause the story kept people protecting him, hiding him, lying for him. The robberies continued through the late 1,860 seconds and into the 1,870 seconds. Jesse and Frank, along with the younger brothers Cole, Jim, John, and Bob, they hit banks all across Missouri and beyond, Iowa, Kentucky, Kansas. They'd ride into town like a thunderstorm, hit fast and hard, then disappear into the countryside where nobody could track 'em, 'cause half the population was sympathetic and the other half was scared. And Jesse kept feeding that Robin Hood legend, kept saying he was fighting for the poor, for the downtrodden, for Southern honor. Kept saying the banks and railroads were the real criminals, that he was just taking back what they'd stolen. But here's what Jesse never mentioned in those newspaper letters: the farmers he robbed, the country stores he held up, the stagecoaches full of regular travelers he stopped and emptied, the train passengers he terrorized, including women and children, while he searched their luggage for valuables. Jesse claimed he only robbed the rich, but I talked to descendants of folks who lost everything to his gang. Farmers who'd saved for years, kept their money at home 'cause they didn't trust banks, and lost it all when Jesse came calling. Store owners who'd given Jesse credit during hard times, then got robbed blind for their kindness. Neighbors who'd hidden Jesse from the law, only to have him steal their horses or their savings or their daughter's jewelry. That's the truth the legend won't tell you. Jesse James robbed his own kind, robbed people who'd fought for the Confederacy, who'd suffered under Reconstruction, who'd believed his lies about fighting for a cause. He robbed them and then had the gall to claim he was their champion. I got a letter here, copy of one, anyway, originals in a museum somewhere, written by Jesse to the Kansas City Times in 1872. In it, he swears he's innocent of the charges against him, says he only takes from those who deserve it, claims he's been forced into outlawry by persecution, reads real noble, sounds like a man of principle. But the very next week after that letter was published, Jesse robbed the Columbia, Kentucky Deposit Bank, got $5,000. One of the customers in the bank was an old woman, Confederate widow, lost her husband at Shiloh. She had $300 she was depositing her dead husband's pension money, saved up for months. Jesse took it, took every penny from a Confederate widow while preaching about Southern honor. See, that's the thing about Jesse. He didn't just steal money, he stole people's faith, made 'em believe he was something he wasn't, made 'em risk everything to protect him, then robbed 'em blind and moved on to the next town, the next mark, the next lie. The James Younger gang became famous. Newspapers tracked their every move, turning robberies into adventures and murders into battles.
Dime novels made Jesse into a hero, noble outlaw fighting corrupt bankers like Robin Hood with revolvers. Young men wanted to be him, young women wanted to marry him. Old veterans toasted his health and called him the last Confederate soldier. But the people who actually knew Jesse, who'd seen what he really was, they told different stories. Told about his temper, how he'd kill a man for looking at him wrong. Told about his paranoia, how he trusted nobody and slept with a gun under his pillow. Told about his greed, how he'd count and recount the loot from a robbery, making sure he got the biggest share. Jesse liked to quote the Bible, could recite scripture from memory, talk about redemption and judgment and the meek inheriting the earth. His mama raised him Baptist, taught him right from wrong, made sure he knew God's word. And Jesse believed it in his way, believed he was justified, believed God had chosen him to punish the wicked and defend the righteous. That's what made him so dangerous. He wasn't just a thief. He was a thief who thought he was a prophet, a murderer who thought he was a missionary, a man who'd turned greed into a religion and called his sins holy war. The wind shifted now, coming from the north. Got that edge to it that says winter's not far off. Jesse's robberies were getting bolder, the stakes getting higher. He'd gone from banks to trains, robbed his first train in 1873, stopped the Rock Island line near Adair, Iowa, got $3,000 and killed the engineer when the train derailed. More money, more blood, more lies about fighting for the common man while the common man's blood dried on the tracks. Earl leans in now, voice dropping to almost a whisper. He didn't steal to eat, partner. He stole to shine. That's the truth of it. Jesse James didn't rob because he had to. He robbed because he loved it, loved the thrill, loved the danger, loved seeing his name in the papers and hearing people talk about him in hushed tones. The gold was just a way of keeping score. The real prize was the legend, the reputation, the fear and admiration he saw in people's eyes. But legends have a way of collapsing under their own weight, and Jesse's was about to come crashing down in a town called Northfield, Minnesota, where the Robin Hood lie would finally meet the truth and the truth would be waiting with loaded guns. September 7th, 1876. That's the date when Jesse James's luck finally ran out, when the legend cracked wide open and showed the bloody truth underneath. When the James Younger gang rode into a little town called Northfield, Minnesota, expecting easy money, and got a bloodbath instead. Now, Northfield wasn't like the towns in Missouri where Jesse operated. In Missouri, folks knew him, feared him, or at least knew enough to stay out of his way. Half the population was sympathetic to the Confederate cause, and the other half was too scared to do much about Jesse and his gang. But Minnesota was different. Minnesota was Yankee country through and through, and the folks there didn't take kindly to Southern outlaws riding into their town with guns drawn. Jesse had gotten cocky by then. 10 years of successful robberies had convinced him he was untouchable. He'd robbed banks in Missouri, Kentucky, Iowa, Kansas, hit trains and stagecoaches, made thousands of dollars, and never spent a day in jail. The law couldn't catch him. The Pinkertons couldn't catch him. Hell, even when they bombed his mama's house in 1875, killed his half-brother, and blew off his mama's arm, even that didn't stop him. Just made him more famous, more sympathetic in the public eye. So when Jesse decided to rob the First National Bank of Northfield, he wasn't worried. It was just another job, another payday. He brought the full gang: Frank, the younger brothers, Charlie Pitts, Clell Miller, Bill Chadwell. 8 men total, all experienced, all deadly. They'd done this dozens of times before. They rode into town on a Thursday afternoon, split up to avoid suspicion. 3 men would go into the bank: Bob Younger, Charlie Pitts, and 1 other. The others would guard the horses and watch the street. Simple plan, in and out, done it 100 times, but somebody noticed. A hardware store owner named J.S. Allen saw the men loitering outside the bank, saw one of them try the door, saw the way they were dressed, long dusters in September weather, hands hovering near their guns. Allen knew trouble when he saw it. He ran into the street yelling, "Get your guns, boys, they're robbing the bank." Everything went sideways from there. Inside the bank, the robbers had their guns out, ordering the cashier fellow named Joseph Haywood to open the safe. Haywood refused, told him the safe was on a time lock, couldn't be opened. It was a lie. The safe wasn't locked at all, but Haywood was brave, braver than Jesse expected. Outside, the townspeople were arming themselves. Minnesota wasn't like Missouri. These folks had fought in the war, same as Jesse had, but they'd fought for the Union, and they weren't about to let some Confederate bushwhackers rob their bank. They grabbed rifles, shotguns, pistols, whatever they could find, and started shooting at the outlaws in the street. Clell Miller caught the first bullet, then another. He fell off his horse, bleeding from multiple wounds. Bill Chadwell took a round through the heart, died before he hit the ground. The other gang members were returning fire, but they were outgunned and surrounded. Citizens were shooting from windows, from doorways, from behind wagons. It was an ambush, except the gang were the ones getting ambushed. Inside the bank, things were getting desperate. Haywood still wouldn't open the safe, and the sounds of gunfire from outside told the robbers things weren't going according to plan. One of them hit Haywood across the head with a gun. The cashier went down but still refused to open the safe. Then somebody stuck their head in the door and shouted, "The game's up! Come out or we're all dead men." As they ran for the door, one of them accounts differ on who turned back and shot Joseph Haywood in the head. Killed him, execution style, just out of pure spite for not cooperating. An unarmed man doing his job, protecting his bank's money, shot down like a dog. The gang burst out of the bank into hell. The entire town was shooting at them now. Must have been 50, 60 guns firing from every direction. Bob Younger took a bullet in the elbow. Jim Younger caught one in the shoulder. Cole Younger got hit in the hip. Their horses were panicked, wheeling and rearing. 2 of their men were already dead in the street. They ran, just flat out ran, shooting behind them as they went, leaving their dead companions where they'd fallen. Rode out of town like the devil himself was chasing them, bleeding, hurting, knowing they'd just been beaten by shopkeepers and farmers. The posse that formed up was the biggest Minnesota had ever seen. Hundreds of men, maybe 1,000, combed the countryside looking for the gang, and they were good at it. These were men who knew how to track, how to hunt, how to read signs in the wilderness. They weren't some local sheriff and a couple deputies. This was an army. For 2 weeks, the gang ran. 2 weeks through rain and cold, through swamps and forests, stealing horses when theirs gave out, splitting up and reuniting, always moving, always one step ahead of the posse. They were starving, their wounds were infecting, and they knew it was only a matter of time. Finally, near Madelia, Minnesota, the posse caught up to them. Cornered 6 of them, the Younger brothers, Charlie Pitts, and 2 others. Jesse and Frank had already split off, managed to slip through the net somehow. Always did have the devil's own luck when it came to survival. The shootout near Madelia was brief and brutal. Charlie Pitts died in the first volley. The Younger brothers, all 3 of them wounded, already kept fighting until they ran out of ammunition, then surrendered. Cole Younger had 11 bullets in him. 11. Bob had been shot so many times they lost count. Jim had a shattered jaw. They were more blood than man by the time they raised their hands. They were taken to Stillwater Prison, all 3 of them, given life sentences. Cole would spend 25 years behind bars. Bob would die in prison of tuberculosis in 1889. Jim would get paroled eventually, but he'd never be the same. Shot himself in 1902. Couldn't live with what he'd become. But Jesse and Frank, they got away. Rode back to Missouri somehow, wounded but alive, and went into hiding. Left their friends to rot in prison while they disappeared like smoke. The James Younger gang was finished, destroyed. The most successful outlaw gang in American history, shattered in one afternoon by shopkeepers and farmers who refused to be victims. The newspapers called it the Northfield disaster, and that's exactly what it was, a disaster for the outlaws, a victory for the law. The money from Northfield, they never got it, not a single dollar. Joseph Haywood died protecting that safe, and his death meant something because the robbers left empty-handed. But they also left him dead, and 2 of his neighbors dead, and the streets soaked in blood, all for nothing, all because Jesse James thought he could take whatever he wanted, wherever he wanted. Some folks say the money from Northfield was cursed, say that anyone who went after Jesse's gang that day was marking themselves for death, if not in Northfield, then later, somewhere down the line. Say you can still feel something wrong in the air on Division Street where the shootout happened, like the violence left a stain that won't wash away. I don't put much stock in curses myself, but I'll tell you this, the men who rode with Jesse to Northfield, they were cursed, sure enough. Cursed by their own greed, their own violence, their own belief that they were above the law. They rode into Minnesota thinking they were untouchable legends, and they rode out broken men, or they didn't ride out at all. Earl whispers now, voice dropping low. They say the money was cursed. I say the men were. The fire's crackling in the silence that follows. Sometimes the truth is quieter than a whisper, but it cuts deeper than any shout. Jesse James and his gang rode into Northfield on September 7th, 1876. Only 2 of them rode out. The rest stayed behind in the ground, in prison cells, in the memories of the townspeople who'd faced them down and won. That was the beginning of the end for Jesse James. He just didn't know it yet. After Northfield, Jesse went to ground like a fox with the hounds on his trail. He and Frank disappeared for near about 3 years, just vanished from Missouri, from the news, from everywhere. Folks whispered about where they might be hiding, but nobody knew for certain. Some said Texas, some said California. Some said they'd fled to South America with what gold they had left. Truth was simpler and closer to home. Jesse was right there in Missouri the whole time, sometimes in Tennessee, living under false names, keeping his head down, letting the heat from Northfield cool off. He called himself Thomas Howard, pretended to be a respectable businessman, went to church on Sundays, played the part of a decent man, but he was still Jesse James underneath, and Jesse James couldn't stay quiet for long. By 1879, he was robbing again. Trains, mostly easier than banks after Northfield taught him that townspeople would fight back. He put together a new gang, younger men who didn't have the experience of the youngers but had plenty of ambition and not enough sense. Charlie and Bob Ford, Wood Height, Dick LaDeal, men who wanted to ride with the legend, who wanted to say they'd been part of Jesse James's gang. Jesse was living well by then, too well for a man supposed to be hiding. He had a nice house in Street Joseph, Missouri, rented under his alias, but nice all the same. Had fine horses in the stable, fine clothes in his wardrobe, fine furniture in his parlor. His wife, Z, his cousin, actually, which was common enough in those days, she dressed like a lady from a wealthy family. His children wanted for nothing. All that cost money. Money Jesse was still stealing, still taking from banks and trains and anyone else who had what he wanted. But now he had another expense, silence. See, after Northfield, the rewards for Jesse's capture had gone up considerable. $10,000 for Jesse, dead or alive. $5,000 for Frank. That's more money than most farmers would see in a lifetime. That's enough to tempt even friends, even family, even men who rode with you. So Jesse started paying people to keep quiet, paying neighbors not to ask questions about Thomas Howard, paying old guerrilla comrades to swear they hadn't seen him, paying lawmen to look the other way. Even paying preachers gave generous donations to churches, made sure the ministers remembered him come Sunday morning when they were praying for the community. Jesse thought he could buy loyalty the same way he bought everything else. Thought gold could purchase silence, friendship, protection. And for a while, it worked. The law couldn't find him. The Pinkertons couldn't track him. He moved through Missouri like a ghost, robbing and spending and robbing, always one step ahead of justice. But here's the thing about buying loyalty. It only lasts as long as you're the highest bidder. And that $10,000 reward was looking mighty attractive to men who were risking their necks for a few $100s per robbery. Jesse's new gang wasn't like the old one. The youngers had been family, Practically men who'd ridden with Jesse through the war, who'd bled beside him, who'd proven their loyalty 100 times over. These new men were different. They were in it for the money and the glory, and they had no deep ties to Jesse beyond what he paid them. Woodhite and Dick Little got into a dispute, some say over a woman, some say over money from a robbery. They shot each other up at a safe house. Hite died. Little survived and started talking to the law, cutting a deal to save his own skin. Just like that, Jesse's protection started crackling like thin ice. Then there were the Ford brothers, Charlie and Bob. Young men, early 20s, from a family that had Confederate sympathies but not much else. They'd grown up hearing stories about Jesse James, about his daring raids and narrow escapes. They wanted to be part of that legend. Jesse took them in, let them ride with the gang, trusted them enough to let them into his home. Bob Ford, especially Jesse, seemed to take a shine to him, treated him almost like a younger brother, had him stay at the house in Street Joseph, ate meals with him, talked about future robberies. But Bob Ford was talking to someone else too, talking to Governor Thomas Crittenden of Missouri, who'd put up that $10,000 reward, talking to the law about how to get close enough to Jesse to collect it. Jesse, for all his paranoia, didn't see it coming. Maybe he'd gotten too comfortable. Maybe he thought his reputation would protect him forever. Maybe he just couldn't imagine that someone he'd trusted, someone he'd welcomed into his home, would sell him out for gold. But that's exactly what was about to happen. The money Jesse spent buying silence, it was all just borrowed time. Every coin he handed over was another delay, another day before the inevitable. 'Cause you can't buy loyalty, partner. You can rent it for a while, but eventually the lease runs out. And when you've built your whole life on theft and murder and betrayal, you shouldn't be surprised when betrayal comes knocking on your own door. I'm looking at a ledger here, copy of one anyway. Shows Jesse's expenses from 1,880 to 1,882. It's amazing what survived, what got preserved. Shows payments to friends and associates, hundreds of dollars a month just to keep mouths shut. Shows contributions to churches Jesse gave generously. Made sure everyone knew Thomas Howard was a God-fearing man. Shows money spent on lawyers, on bribes, on information. Jesse was hemorrhaging gold just to stay free, which meant he had to keep stealing, to keep paying, to keep stealing. It was a circle that couldn't be broken except one way, with him dead or in prison. Every night, Jesse would sit at his table counting money. His wife Z told people about it later, how he'd stack the coins, count the bills, figure what needed to go where, who needed paying off this week, who might turn on him if he didn't keep 'em sweet. The gold owned him by then, completely. Wasn't his servant anymore, was his master. And every coin he counted seemed to echo louder in that little house, like someone was keeping score on the other side, like every dollar stolen, every payment made, was being written down in a ledger that would come due eventually. Bob Ford heard that jangle of coins, heard it and thought about that $10,000 reward, thought about how he could be rich, famous, the man who killed Jesse James, thought about how easy it would be, just wait for the right moment, pull the trigger, collect the money. Jesse should have heard it too, should have heard the betrayal coming and the clink of gold changing hands. But greed makes you deaf to everything but its own voice, and Jesse's greed was deafening. Earl's voice drops even lower now. Ain't no man ever bought peace with stolen money, only time. And Jesse's time was running out faster than sand through an hourglass. Every coin he spent added another second to the countdown. Every payment he made brought him one step closer to that morning in April when he'd climb on a chair to dust a picture, and Bob Ford would raise his gun. The gold that had made Jesse rich was buying him nothing but a slower path to the grave. And come April 3rd, 1,882, that path would finally run out. April 3rd, 1882, Street, Joseph, Missouri. A Monday morning clear and bright, with spring finally showing its face after a long winter. The kind of morning that makes you think everything might turn out all right, that maybe today's the day things change for the better. Jesse James woke up that morning in the house on Lafayette Street, the house he'd rented under the name Thomas Howard. It was a modest place, nothing fancy, but comfortable. 2 stories, white clapboard, with a small yard where his children could play. The kind of house a respectable businessman might live in. The kind of house that said, "I'm nobody special, just a regular fellow trying to make his way." But Jesse James was never going to be nobody special. That just wasn't in his nature. He'd been planning another robbery. Had it all mapped out, the Platte City Bank over in Platte County. Easy target, he thought. Good payday. Him and Charlie Ford and Bob Ford would hit it that week, maybe Wednesday or Thursday. Just needed to finalize a few details. The Ford brothers had been staying with Jesse for a while now, sleeping in the house, eating at his table, playing with his kids. Jesse trusted them about as much as Jesse trusted anybody, which wasn't much, but he needed them. His old gang was gone dead, imprisoned, or scattered. These Ford boys were young and eager, and Jesse figured he could use that. What he didn't know was that Bob Ford had already made his decision, had already talked to Governor Crittenden, already worked out the deal. $10,000 for Jesse James, dead or alive. A full pardon for Bob and Charlie's past crimes. Fame, fortune, and freedom, all for pulling one trigger. That morning started normal enough. Z cooked breakfast eggs and bacon and biscuits. The children were loud and playful the way children are before the world teaches them to be quiet. Jesse ate slow, methodical, his mind probably already on the Platte City job. Bob and Charlie Ford sat at the table too, eating and talking about nothing in particular. After breakfast, it was warm enough that Jesse took off his coat. Then he did something he almost never did. He took off his gun belt, set it on the bed, both pistols still in their holsters. The Ford brothers watched him do it, and something passed between them. A look, a nod, the kind of silent conversation that happens between conspirators. Now, Jesse never took off his guns. Never. Slept with them, ate with them, wore them from the moment he woke till the moment he closed his eyes at night. Those pistols had saved his life more times than he could count, and he treated them like extra limbs. For him to set them aside, even for a few minutes, that was unusual, dangerous even. But maybe he'd gotten too comfortable in that little house. Maybe he thought Thomas Howard was safe, in a way Jesse James never could be. Maybe he just didn't see it coming because he couldn't imagine that these boys, these kids who'd been staying in his house, eating his food, laughing with his family, would actually do it. There was a picture on the wall, a framed photograph. Some say it was a picture of a racehorse. Others say it was a needlework sampler that said, "God bless our home." Don't really matter what it was. What matters is that Jesse noticed it was dusty, crooked maybe, and he decided to straighten it up. He pulled a chair over to the wall, climbed up on it, reached up to adjust the picture frame, and for just a moment, just a handful of seconds, his back was turned to the Ford brothers and his guns were across the room on the bed. Bob Ford had been waiting for this moment, had been watching for days, maybe weeks, waiting for Jesse to be vulnerable, to be unarmed, to be distracted. And now, finally, here it was, Jesse James standing on a chair with his back turned, completely defenseless. Bob pulled his pistol, a Smith & Wesson, .44 caliber that Jesse had given him as a gift. The irony of that wouldn't be lost on folks later. Used Jesse's own gun to kill him. He raised it, aimed at the back of Jesse's head, and some accounts say he hesitated for just a second, just a heartbeat, maybe thinking about what he was doing. Maybe wondering if he could really go through with it. Maybe just making sure his aim was true. Then he pulled the trigger. The sound was enormous in that small room, like thunder had come indoors. The bullet caught Jesse right behind the ear, traveled through his brain, and exited through his forehead. He dropped instantly, didn't even have time to turn around, to see who'd shot him, to reach for a gun he didn't have. Just fell off that chair and hit the floor. Dead before his body finished falling. Z came running at the sound, found her husband lying in a pool of blood, Bob Ford standing there with a smoking gun, and Charlie Ford backing toward the door. she screamed. The children came running, saw their daddy on the floor, saw the blood, and their screams joined their mother's. Bob Ford didn't run, didn't even try to. He walked out the front door, found a telegraph office, and sent a message to Governor Crittenden. "I have killed Jesse James. Send help." Just like that, cold as winter, businesslike. He'd completed his transaction, one dead outlaw, in exchange for $10,000 and a pardon. The most famous murder in American history, and Bob Ford treated it like he was reporting the delivery of a package. The news spread like wildfire. Jesse James was dead. Shot in his own home by one of his own men. The legend was over. The outlaw who'd terrorized the Midwest for 16 years, who'd robbed dozens of banks and trains, who'd killed God knows how many men brought down by a bullet in the back from a coward he'd trusted. The newspapers went crazy. Some called it justice finally served. Others called it the worst kind of betrayal, shooting an unarmed man in his own home, in front of his wife and children. Ballads were written within days. Songs about the dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard and laid poor Jesse in his grave. But here's the thing that's always stuck with me about Jesse's death. That picture he was dusting, accounts vary about what it was, but several folks say it was a photograph of Jesse himself. Jesse James, the legend, the hero he'd built himself up to be in those newspaper letters and dime novels. He died reaching up to clean the image of himself, trying to keep his legend shiny and perfect. And while he was doing that, while he was tending to his reputation instead of watching his back, death came for him. There's poetry in that, dark poetry. Jesse James spent his whole life building a legend, telling lies about who he was and what he stood for, and in the end, that legend killed him. He was so busy being Jesse James the legend that he forgot to be Jesse James the man who needed to stay armed and watchful. The picture stayed on the wall after he fell, stayed there while the law came to investigate, stayed there while they carried Jesse's body out and laid it in a coffin, stayed there as a reminder that vanity and greed make poor companions, and that the image you build of yourself might be the death of you. Earl's voice falls quiet now, almost a whisper. That's how greed kills, partner, from behind. The fire's burning low, throwing long shadows across the porch, and in those shadows you can almost see it a man standing on a chair, reaching up to touch his own image, never knowing that death is standing right behind him with a loaded gun. Jesse James died with a bullet in his back, killed by a man he'd trusted, in a house where he'd thought he was safe. All that stolen gold couldn't buy him one more second of life. All those payments to keep people silent couldn't silence the gun that ended him. All his cleverness, all his reputation, all his legend useless when it came down to one moment, one choice, one trigger pull. That's the way of it with men like Jesse. They think they're special, think the rules don't apply to them, think they can keep taking and killing and betraying forever, but eventually the bill comes due. Eventually somebody's standing behind you with a gun. Eventually greed catches up to you and collects what it's owed. And Jesse, he never even got to turn around, never got to see it coming, just dropped like a stone, and all that gold, all that legend, all that reputation buried with him in a grave that would be dug up and robbed more times than anyone can count by folks looking for treasure that was never there. The funeral was 3 days later, April 6th, 1882. They buried Jesse in the yard of the family farm in Kearney, Missouri. His mama insisted on it. Wanted him close where she could tend the grave, where she could keep watch over him the way she couldn't when he was alive and running. The coffin was open. Thousands of people came to see, not to mourn really, but to look, to see if it was really him, if the legend was really dead. They filed past that coffin all day long, staving at the body, touching the wood like it was some kind of holy relic. Jesse's mama charged them a quarter each. Even in death, the James family was making money off Jesse's name. He looked peaceful lying there, they said, clean-shaven, hands folded, dressed in his best suit. Didn't look like a killer, didn't look like a thief, Just looked like a man who died too young, which I suppose he was. 34 years old. Most men that age are just getting started in life. Jesse was already finished. The newspapers couldn't decide how to tell the story. Some called it justice the outlaw finally brought low, the criminal finally made to pay. Others called it murder, an unarmed man shot in his own home by a traitor who'd been his guest. The arguments raged for weeks, months, years, still rage today, actually. Was Jesse a hero or a villain? Was Bob Ford a brave law enforcer or a backstabbing coward? The truth, as usual, is more complicated than either version. Bob and Charlie Ford were arrested immediately after the shooting, charged with murder, but the trial was a formality. Governor Crittenden had promised them pardons, and he kept his word. They were convicted, sentenced to hang, then pardoned within hours. The whole thing was theater, a show for the public to make it look like justice was being served while the real deal had already been made in back rooms and telegraph offices. Bob Ford got his money, $10,000, split between him and Charlie and various lawmen who'd helped arrange the whole thing. Not as much as Bob had hoped. Expenses and cuts ate up most of it, but it was still more money than most folks would see in a lifetime. He thought it would make him famous, thought he'd be celebrated as the man who ended Jesse James, the lawman who brought down the most dangerous outlaw in America. Thought people would shake his hand and buy him drinks and treat him like a hero. Instead, they spit on him. See, even folks who'd hated Jesse, who'd been terrorized by him, who'd lost money or loved ones to his gang, even they couldn't stomach what Bob Ford had done. There's codes in the West, unwritten rules about how men conduct themselves. And shooting an unarmed man in the back, a man who'd trusted you enough to let you into his home that violated every one of those codes. The ballad Jesse James was written within weeks of the murder. You probably know it. Jesse James was a lad who killed many a man. He robbed the Glendale train. But that dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard has laid poor Jesse in his grave. It spread like wildfire, sung in saloons and parlors all across the country. Bob Ford couldn't go anywhere without hearing it. He tried to capitalize on his fame. Toured with a stage show reenacting the murder. Bob would play himself. Some actor would play Jesse, and they'd perform the shooting over and over, 8 shows a week. Folks came to see it, but not to cheer. They came to hiss and boo, to call Bob a coward, to throw things at the stage. Charlie Ford couldn't take it. The shame, the hatred, the constant reminder of what they'd done. He killed himself in 1884, just 2 years after Jesse's death, put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger. Some say it was guilt. Some say it was just the weight of being hated everywhere he went. Either way, he chose the bullet over living with what he'd done. Bob lasted longer, but not by much. He drifted west, opened a saloon in Creede, Colorado. Thought maybe he could start fresh where people didn't know him, but the reputation followed him like a shadow. Every drunk who recognized him wanted to fight him, to prove they were tougher than the man who killed Jesse James. Every storyteller wanted to tell the tale one more time, point Bob out, watch him squirm. In 1892, a man named Ed O'Kelly walked into Bob Ford's saloon with a shotgun. Some say O'Kelly was avenging Jesse. Some say he just wanted to be known as the man who killed Jesse James. Either way, he didn't hesitate. Walked right up to Bob and blew him away with both barrels. Bob Ford died at 30 years old, killed by the same kind of violence he'd dealt out, and folks said it was justice, said Bob got what he deserved. Nobody sang ballads about Bob Ford, nobody mourned him, nobody tended his grave. He died and was forgotten, just another name in the long list of men killed by the legend of Jesse James. But Jesse's gold? That's where the story gets strange. Jesse had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars over his career, maybe more. But when he died, they found almost nothing. A few $100s in the house, some jewelry, a couple of good horses. Where was the rest of it? The rumors started immediately. Jesse had buried it, folks said. Had caches hidden all over Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, everywhere he'd operated. gold buried in caves, in hollow trees, under creek beds, in abandoned mines. Treasure maps were drawn, landmarks identified, stories told about Jesse digging holes by moonlight and filling them with bags of coins. People started searching, started digging. The James family farm was torn apart by treasure hunters dug up so many times they had to post guards. Caves near Kearney were explored and re-explored, every stone turned, every crevice searched. The woods where Jesse used to hide were combed inch by folks looking for buried gold. They never found it. Or if they did, they never told anybody about it. Some say the gold never existed, that Jesse spent it as fast as he stole it, that the fine clothes and the bribes and the cost of staying hidden ate up every dollar. Others say he buried it so well nobody will ever find it. Still others whisper that the gold is cursed, that anyone who finds it will meet the same fate as Jesse, betrayed and shot down by someone they trust. I knew a man once, old fellow named Curtis Rayburn, who spent 20 years of his life searching for Jesse's gold. Had maps, had stories his granddad told him, had theories about where Jesse would have hidden it. He'd go out every weekend with a metal detector and a shovel, digging holes all over Clay County. Never found a thing, died broke and bitter, his whole life wasted chasing a legend that probably never existed. His wife left him, his children stopped talking to him. He lost his job because he was too busy digging holes to show up for work. The gold or the dream of it destroyed him as surely as it destroyed Jesse. That's the price of Jesse's name. The men who rode with him ended up dead or in prison. The man who killed him was hated and murdered. The people who tried to find his gold wasted their lives chasing shadows. Even his mama spent her last years as a curiosity, selling pebbles from his grave and telling stories about her poor misunderstood boy to tourists who paid to hear them. The newspapers called it betrayal. The crowds called it justice. But the West, the real West, the one that lives in stories and memories, the West called it balance. Jesse James took and took and took, and eventually the universe took back. Took his life, his gang, his legend, his gold. Took everything he'd built and scattered it like dust. Some say they still hear his voice in the caves near Kearney, whispering to treasure hunters, leading them deeper into the darkness, promising gold that's never there. Some say on foggy nights you can see him riding the old trails, still counting coins that turn to dust in his hands, still reaching for more even though he's been dead over a century. I don't put much stock in ghost stories, but I'll tell you this, Jesse's legacy haunts Missouri still. Every bank he robbed, every train he stopped, every man he killed, those stories are still told, still remembered. The price of his name is paid every time somebody tells the tale. Every time somebody warns their children about greed and betrayal. Every time somebody looks at an old photograph and wonders what drives a man to throw his life away for gold. The price of his name, measured in bodies and betrayals, in wasted lives and empty graves, in treasure that might not exist and legends that won't die. That's what Jesse James left behind, not gold, but ghosts. Not riches, but ruins. Not a legacy to be proud of, but a warning to be heeded. Funny thing about legends, they don't die the way normal men do. You can put a bullet in their brain, put their body in the ground, throw dirt over the coffin till the grave is full. But the legend just keeps on riding. Within a year of Jesse's death, the dime novels started appearing. Jesse James, the Outlaw, and the life and adventures of Jesse James and a dozen others, each one more fantastical than the last. They turned him into Robin Hood, into a hero fighting against corrupt banks and evil railroads. They made up stories about him giving money to widows and orphans, about him only stealing from Yankees and carpetbaggers, about him being a gentleman bandit who never hurt innocent folks. It was all lies, of course, but it was lies that people wanted to believe. See, by the 1,880 seconds and 90 seconds, the West was changing. The open range was being fenced off. The railroads had connected everything. The buffalo were gone, the Indians were on reservations, and the wild frontier was becoming civilized. People missed the old days, or thought they did anyway. They romanticized them, turned the violence and hardship into adventure and glory, and Jesse James became the symbol of all that. The last rebel, the man who wouldn't bow down, the outlaw who lived free and died free. Never mind that he'd been a thief and a murderer. Never mind that he'd robbed his own kind and killed innocent people. The legend smoothed all that over, turned the rough edges into romantic highlights. The James family encouraged it. Jesse's mama, Zerelda, that tough old woman who'd raised her boys to be fighters, she saw opportunity in the legend. She sold tours of the farm, charged people to see where Jesse had grown up. She sold authentic artifacts, bullets supposedly fired by Jesse, pieces of wood from the house where he died, even rocks from his grave. Most of it was fake, but people didn't care. They wanted a piece of the legend, and Zerelda was happy to sell it to them. Jesse's children grew up in that strange shadow. His son, Jesse Edwards James, became a lawyer, spent his whole life trying to restore his father's reputation, writing articles and giving speeches about how Jesse had been a hero, a freedom fighter, a victim of Yankee persecution. Never mind the banks his daddy robbed, never mind the men his daddy killed. The legend was more important than the truth. And then there were the imposters. For 20 years after Jesse's death, men kept popping up, claiming to be him, claiming the body in the grave wasn't really Jesse, that he'd faked his death, that he'd been living quiet somewhere and was only now revering himself. One fellow named Jay, Frank Dalton, got pretty famous with it. Showed up in the 1,942nd, 60 years after Jesse's death, claiming to be the real Jesse James. Said Bob Ford had shot somebody else and Jesse had used it as a chance to disappear. The old man knew details about Jesse's life, could tell stories that seemed authentic. He even had scars in the right places. People wanted to believe him. They held parades for him, put him on the radio, interviewed him for magazines. The idea that Jesse was still alive, that the legend hadn't really died, was too good to resist. They exhumed Jesse's grave in 1995 to settle it once and for all. Used DNA testing, modern forensics, all the tools of science. And they confirmed what most folks already knew: the body in the grave was Jesse James. He died in 1882, just like the record said. All those imposters had been lying, trading on the legend for their own gain. But here's the thing: the fact that people believed those imposters, the fact that they wanted to believe, tells you something about the power of Jesse's legend. He'd become bigger than life, bigger than death, bigger than truth itself. They still see him sometimes, or say they do. Riders in the fog near Liberty, Missouri, where Jesse robbed his first bank. A man on horseback crossing the creek near Kearney at dawn, head bowed low like he's ashamed of something. Shadows in the caves where Jesse used to hide, shadows that move and shift and seem almost alive. I don't claim to know if ghosts are real, but I know this: Jesse James haunts Missouri, whether he's a real ghost or not. Every time somebody tells his story, he rides again. Every time somebody sings that ballad, he dies again. Every time somebody goes looking for his gold, he leads them deeper into darkness. The truth about Jesse is quieter than the legend, but it's there if you look for it. The truth says he was a man who loved gold more than God, a man who turned greed into his religion and counted his sins in stolen coins, a man who robbed his own kind, betrayed his own people, and died reaching up to touch an image of himself that was as false as every word he'd ever spoken. But the legend don't care about truth. The legend says he was a hero, a rebel, a romantic figure fighting against the forces of oppression, and that legend is what survives, what gets passed down, what people remember. There's a statue of Jesse in Kearney now, put up by the town in the 1,970 shows him standing tall, hand on his gun, looking brave and noble. Tourists come to take pictures with it, children climb on it, people leave flowers at the base sometimes, and every time I see that statue, I think about the men Jesse killed, the families he destroyed, the people he robbed, his own neighbors, his own kind. I think about how the legend has swallowed the truth so completely that we put up statues to murderers and call them heroes. But maybe that's just how legends work. Maybe they have to smooth out the rough edges, have to make villains into heroes, have to turn blood and gold into romance and adventure. Maybe people need legends more than they need truth, need stories that lift them up instead of showing them the dark corners of human nature. Jesse James, the man, is dead and buried. But Jesse James, the legend, he's still riding, still robbing banks in dime novels and movies, still fighting for the little man in songs and stories, still whispering about buried gold to anyone fool enough to listen. They still see him sometimes, they say. A rider in the fog, crossing the same creek he once escaped through, head bowed low like he's carrying a weight that won't lift. The ghost of Jesse James, forever riding, forever stealing, forever counting coins that turn to dust in his hands. That's how greed works, partner. It don't die when you die. It lives on in the stories, in the treasure hunters who waste their lives, in the legends that turn thieves into heroes. It echoes through time, that sound of gold coins jingling in saddlebags, calling out to anyone who'll listen. And some folks still answer that call, still go digging for Jesse's gold, still believing the legend over the truth. That's the ghost of Jesse James, not a man riding through the fog, but an idea that won't die, a hunger that keeps spreading, a lie that's become more powerful than any truth could ever be. The fire's about gone out now, just coals glowing red in the darkness. The night's deep and cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and reminds you that winter's never too far away, even when spring's supposed to be here. We've covered a lot of ground tonight, partner. Talked about a man who was born decent enough, but let the war turn him into something else. Talked about robberies and murders dressed up as noble causes. Talked about the Robin Hood lie and the Northfield disaster. Talked about gold that bought nothing but betrayal, and a bullet in the back that ended a legend but somehow made it stronger. And now here we are at the end of the story, or what passes for an end. 'Cause stories like Jesse's don't really end. They just pause, waiting to be told again, waiting for the next person to hear that jangle of gold and think they can do it different, do it better, get away with it when others didn't. I'm looking out at the darkness now, at the prairie grass moving in the wind like waves on a black ocean, and I'm thinking about all the men who've ridden through these parts chasing gold, chasing glory, chasing something they can't even name. Jesse was just one of them. There were others before him, and Lord knows there's been plenty after. What made Jesse different, what turned him from just another outlaw into a legend that's lasted near 150 years, was the story he told about himself, the lie he sold, the way he convinced people he was fighting for them when really he was just fighting for himself. Maybe Jesse wasn't born wicked. Maybe he really was just a farm boy who got caught up in a war, who learned that violence could pay, who found out he was good at killing and couldn't figure out how to do anything else. Maybe the war broke something in him that couldn't be fixed, turned him into something that couldn't exist in peacetime. Or maybe, and this is what troubles me late at night, maybe Jesse was always going to end up where he ended up. Maybe the war just gave him an excuse to be what he wanted to be all along. Maybe that hunger for gold, for glory, for the sound of his name whispered in fear and admiration, maybe that was always there, just waiting for the right circumstances to come out. I don't know. Can't know. All I know is what happened, and what happened is this. A man spent his whole life stealing and killing and calling it justice, and when he finally stopped counting coins long enough to dust his own picture, somebody put a bullet in his brain. Earl's voice gets even softer now, almost lost in the wind. Maybe Jesse wasn't born wicked. Maybe he just never learned how to stop counting. That's the heart of it, ain't it? The counting. Jesse would sit at his table night after night, stacking coins, sorting bills, figuring what he had and what he needed and how much more he wanted. The gold owned him completely by then. Wasn't his servant, wasn't his tool, was his master, his God, his reason for living, and you can see it if you look close at the photographs of Jesse taken near the end. Look past the pose, past the confident stance and the hand on the gun. Look at his eyes. They're empty, hungry, like there's a hole inside him that can't never be filled, no matter how much gold he pours into it. That's what greed does. Hollows you out from the inside until there's nothing left but the wanting, the needing, the counting and reaching and never being satisfied. The fire pops, sends up a little shower of sparks that disappear into the darkness, like coins scattered in the night, glittering for just a moment before they're gone. Greed's like a coin with no edge, Earl says, and his voice is almost a whisper now. No matter how you flip it, it lands dirty. I've been telling stories about the West for more years than I care to count. Stories about cowboys and outlaws, about gold rushes and ghost towns, about men who lived hard and died harder, and they all got one thing in common. All these stories, they're about what happens when people want too much, when they let the hunger for gold or land or power or fame turn them into something they never meant to be. Jesse James is just one example, a famous one, sure, but he ain't unique. There's been thousands of men like him, tens of thousands, all of them thinking they were special, thinking they could take what they wanted and never pay the price. And they're all dead now, every one of them. Some died quick like Jesse, with a bullet in the back. Some died slow in prison cells, counting days instead of coins. Some died rich and respected, but haunted, knowing what they'd done to get there. And some died still believing their own lies, still thinking they were heroes instead of thieves. But they're all dead just the same. The wind picks up now, moving through the grass with that whispering sound. If you listen close, real close, you can almost hear it. Names, dates, the sound of coins jingling, the echo of gunfire from over a century ago. The ghost of Jesse James forever riding, forever counting, forever reaching for gold that turned to dust in his hands. The prairie's full of ghosts like that. Men who couldn't stop counting, men who traded their souls for gold and their lives for legend, men who thought they were special, thought they were above the law, thought they could keep taking and never have to give back. They were wrong, all of them. And the ground remembers, even if the legends don't. As the wind hums low through the prairie, the story fades, another man gone, another legend still digging. Somewhere out there in the darkness, treasure hunters are still searching for Jesse's gold, still digging holes by moonlight, still believing the lie that there's a cache somewhere, buried deep, just waiting to be found. They won't find it, or if they do, it won't be what they think it is. 'Cause the real treasure Jesse left behind ain't gold. It's a lesson, a warning, a story about what happens when greed becomes your god and counting becomes your prayer. The fire's dead now, just ash and darkness and the cold wind blowing across the prairie. Time for you to head on home, partner. Time for me to go inside and leave these ghosts to their riding and their whispering and their endless, pointless counting. But before you go, remember this. Jesse James robbed his own kind, betrayed his own people, died reaching for an image of himself that was as false as every word he ever spoke. The legend says he was a hero. The ground knows he was a thief. And the gold he spent his whole life stealing and counting and hoarding it didn't save him, didn't protect him, didn't even buy him one extra second of life when Bob Ford raised that gun. All that gold, all that counting, all that greed, and in the end, Jesse James died the same way as any other man. Quick and final, with nothing to show for it but stories and lies and a grave that's been dug up more times than anyone can count by folks still looking for treasure that ain't there. The gold never sleeps, they say, and maybe they're right. Maybe it's still out there somewhere, buried in a cave or hidden under a creek bed, waiting for the next fool to come digging. Or maybe it never existed at all, just another lie Jesse told. Another story that grew in the telling till nobody could separate truth from legend. Don't matter either way. The real curse ain't the gold. It's the wanting of it, the hunger that makes men throw their lives away chasing shadows, the greed that turns brothers into enemies and friends into murderers. That's the ghost of Jesse James. Not a man on a horse, but a hunger that never dies, a lie that keeps spreading, a story that gets told and retold till nobody remembers what was real and what was made up. Good night, partner. The story's told, the fire's out, and the wind's got the prairie to itself now. Tomorrow there'll be other stories, other ghosts, other lessons about greed and gold and the price we pay for wanting too much. But tonight, this story's done. Jesse, James the outlaw who robbed his own kind, the man who turned greed into his religion, the legend who died reaching for his own image, shot in the back by somebody he'd trusted with his life. May we all learn from his mistakes. May we all know when enough is enough. And may we all remember that no amount of gold is worth your soul, no legend is worth your life, and no cause, no matter how noble it sounds, justifies theft and murder and betrayal. The wind carries the story away now, out across the prairie where Jesse used to ride, over the graves of the men he killed and the banks he robbed and the towns he terrorized, carries it into the darkness where legends go to rest between tellings. And somewhere out there the gold that never sleeps keeps right on calling, keeps right on promising, keeps right on destroying anyone fool enough to answer. That's the way of it, partner. That's always been the way of it, and that's likely how it'll always be.